Morning. My name is Dave Ferrier. I was invited here today because I'm a Vietnam veteran. At 18 years old, I served 2 tours of duty in Vietnam. And I can tell you I was a very different young man when I came home from Vietnam than I was when I went to Vietnam. Now, the tough part of going second here today is Art stole all my best lines, okay? I hope you heard as empathetically as I did the points Art was making, okay? Because I and other veterans like me have lived through that, okay? Our very, I think, greatest American writer and philosopher once said there are 3 kinds of lies. There are lies, there are damned lies, and there are statistics. So I'm going to tell you a few statistics this morning, okay? On our very, very small planet, there are 144 countries with no death penalty. None. England, France, Italy, Spain, Greece, Germany, Holland, Ireland, Scotland, every European country, save one, has no death penalty. None. The one country that does, Soviet Russia. Okay? We're aligned with Soviet Russia in the agreement that we should kill offenders. Okay? Not just offenders, but veteran offenders, different topic I'll get to. In the Asian subcontinent, there are a dozen countries that I'm geographically limited in describing to you, but I can tell you Japan has no death penalty. South Korea, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, no death penalty. There is, however, one country in the Asian subcontinent that has capital punishment and leads the world, incidentally, in the number of people they execute. Communist China. So we have Soviet Russia and we have Communist China. Where else is the death penalty flourishing? In the jihadist states of the sub-African continent. Countries like Iran, Iraq, and Saudi Arabia, countries which have a jihad holy war agenda, okay, against the Western cultures, they have a capital punishment, they have a death penalty. Canada does not, Mexico does not, in the entire Americas, which once again I could tell you there's Brazil and Venezuela and Chile and all of these places, there's no death penalty. Just us. In Soviet Russia, Communist China, and the jihadist states. Those are the countries that kill their convicts. Okay? 100 years ago, almost every country I mentioned, England, France, Spain, Italy, Greece, they had a death penalty. But they've outgrown it. They have come to the conclusion, philosophically, ethically, that the state's execution of prisoners is revenge, not justice. And they don't execute anybody. Here, Art had the numbers for you, okay? We have approximately 4,000 people on death row across the country now. Okay, that's stunning. Okay, it's stunning. And of those people, you have the veteran numbers, okay? You got to remember that, like myself, at 18 years old, I enlisted and volunteered to go to Vietnam because my father was a veteran, my grandfather was a veteran, and I thought this is what young men do to serve their country, and I'm proud that I did. And I served with a very good unit in Vietnam, a helicopter ambulance unit. They were called dust-off units. And we flew unarmed helicopters into combat zones to get the wounded to hospitals. And I'm very proud of that. But when I came home, nobody was proud of me. No. veterans, there's been no draft in this country since 1973. So every veteran, every soldier, man or woman who served in the military since 1973 has volunteered to do so. And they took an oath, just as I took an oath. And the oath was to defend this country even unto the cost of my life if necessary. And all of us who did that and received an honorable discharge at the end, okay, have completed a vow to sacrifice our lives if necessary for yours. A staggering number of veterans end up incarcerated, it seems, okay? Several years ago, I was involved in some outpatient counseling in Long Beach, California. And I was being seen by a very brilliant doctor named Dr. Lawrence Albers. And after establishing our rapport and our mutual back and forth, Dr. Albers looked at me and he said, "David, you're a drug addict." And I was offended. I don't do recreational or joy and fun drugs. I don't, never have. He said, "You're a drug addict. Your drug of choice is adrenaline." What I learned at 18 and 19 is I perform very well in stressful situations. And when things get too mundane, I create a stressful situation. I'm a pain in the ass, okay? But I can handle chaos, if you will. I learned that in Vietnam as a young man. And a lot of these prisons, and I've been into the same number of jails Art has in the 30 years I've been doing this work, okay? A lot of these guys exist looking to replace the chaos that they experienced as young men. And we now have a collective title called post-traumatic stress disorder to cover it. That's all I have to say to you today. We are one of the only 4 or 5 countries on our planet that execute people. Veterans are people. And now that I've told all of you this, please go tell somebody else, okay?
Good morning. My name is Tom Dunn. I'm a retired Army major. I served in combat in the Gulf War, and I've represented Kayle Bates for 35 years. In 1989, I made the difficult choice to leave the Army that I loved. I had spent 6 years fighting for our veterans, first as the chief prosecutor for the 1st Special Operations Command Airborne, then as my most prized job as the legal advisor to the 5th Special Forces Group of Green Beret Unit that focused on Middle East issues. My last 2 years, I served as the Senior Defense Counsel with the Army's Public Defender Office in Alaska, and I loved it. I left the Army and its soldiers that I loved to represent men, women, and children on death row. Kayle Bates was my first capital case. He was one of 60-plus warrants that were signed by Governor Martinez the first 18 months that I did capital. At the end of that 18 months, I volunteered and went to war. That's how bad things were. After graduating from high school, Kayle Bates followed his lifetime dream, and he enlisted in the military with the Florida National Guard. That's Kyle's graduation photo from basic training. Kayle is proud of his military service. He volunteered when he was 18. He served for 6 years. He served, as I said, in the Florida National Guard and participated in the unit's activation to quell the race riots in Liberty City in Miami in 1980. He also attended and completed the Army's rigorous jungle training in Panama, Central. His wife said after those two incidences, Kyle was different. He had nightmares. He'd wake up screaming loudly, acting crazy, and not recognizing or remembering where he was. When I took on Kyle's case in 1969, we were able to prove that his trial attorney was ineffective for failing to present a multitude of compelling mitigating evidence, which showed that Kyle was not worthy of death. He was appointed a local counsel who didn't have the ability to talk. So in 1995, I left my job as the executive director of the Georgia Research Center, where we represented everyone on Georgia's death row, and I represented Kyle at the sentencing. Kyle gave up his right to ever get out of prison in this issue. Let me say that again. Kyle gave up his right to never get out of prison. He said, I'll take the life without parole sentence that the legislature had recently passed. But the trial judge said, no. You can't give up your ex post facto rights. That would be wrong. And I said to the judge, Your Honor, this jury is going to sentence Kayle Bates to death, not because he deserved it, but because he'd already served half of the 25 years to life that there was their only alternative to death. Think about that. My prediction was true. 3 hours into deliberations, the jury came back with a note. The note says, are we allowed to recommend life without parole? And the judge says, I can't answer that question. We know what happened. 9 voted for death, 3 for life, and Kyle was sentenced to death. We took the issue up on appeal, and I was very, very confident that we could win. We lost 4-3 in the Florida Supreme Court. Justice Anstead wrote a compelling dissent to that, joined by Justices Pariente and Coe. They all said his resentencing was unconstitutional. Kayle Bates was sentenced to death not because he deserved death, but because the jury did not have an alternative that was meaningful to the 25 years. He already spent almost half of that in death. He's now scheduled to be executed on August 19th at 6 p.m. Governor DeSantis has set a gruesome record of executing more people in a single year than any other governor in Florida history. Absent intervention by the courts, Kyle will be the 10th person and the 4th veteran executed by Governor DeSantis this year. Of the execution warrants signed by Governor DeSantis prior to Kyle's warrant, 95% involved a white victim. 95%. When served with the lawsuit and the supporting statistics, Governor DeSantis signed an execution warrant for Curtis Wisdom, an African-American inmate with 3 African-American victims. I call it akin to an admission of unconstitutional disgrace. Ironically, Mr. Wyndham's family, victim's family, do not want him executed. That he has to die. But that's not all of Kyle's case. Kyle's case presents other troubling issues that remain unanswered and adding to the unfairness of Kyle's conviction and death sentence. Twice, the courts here in Florida have refused Kyle's request for DNA testing. Again, Justice Anstead has stepped forward and dissented, stating, quote, I cannot agree with the majority that Bates is not entitled to have DNA testing of certain evidence in order to bring more certainty to the capital sentencing process. Moreover, recently, we have determined that a relative of the victim actually served on Kyle's original trial jury. Let me say that again. A family member of the victim served on the jury. When Kyle's parent lawyers asked the courts for for permission, which you have to do here in Florida, to interview the juror. The court said 40 years too late. Again, the courts have denied access to trial. Plainly, a system that demonstrates a preference for executing those who have killed white victims. It demonstrates a preference towards executing veterans who bravely and eagerly volunteered their bodies and their minds to serve this country is not a just system. Florida can do better. Thank you for your time. Please spread the word.
Good morning. My name is Bill Kissinger, and I want to talk to you about veterans. I want to talk to you about something else as well. You'll learn that in a minute. The advantage that I have here today is that all the previous speakers outranked me in all but one category. They're all smarter than me. They all dress better than me. They all have 30, 40 years involved in their work here. They're charismatic, so they outrank me. I outrank them in one regard. I'm an ex-offender. I served 47 years in one of the country's worst prisons. I also was a paralegal assigned to death row. So I bring an entirely different perspective to you. That's why I'm speaking last. Here's the thing. When I wore the uniform, 5 days after my 18th birthday, I enlisted. I was supposed to go in the Army, and I wound up getting stolen by the Air Force. I was a smart guy. That's what they said. I was taught and learned that when a brother is hurting, when a brother is wounded, you run to him, you put him on your shoulders, and you carry him as far as you can towards safety. That's what I learned. When I got to prison, I found that it's a little more complicated than that. You pick up those that you want to help. You don't want to help everybody because, well, you got racial lines, and you got class lines, and you got money lines, and you got political lines. You got all these different lines that you have to contend with. And I found, since I've gotten out, it's the same way. One of the things that I was involved in when I was in prison was I created a veterans group called the Camp Vets. And we all did the same thing. When one of us was in trouble, when one of us was hurting, when one of us needed something, we picked each other up and we carried each other. But we didn't just carry each other, we carried those around us that needed help. It's just not in our culture today. Today, Governor Ron DeSantis, and just weeks ago, I carried a petition with over 4,000 signatures to his office. And when I carried them, I was scared to death. It was my first official interaction with someone. And it made me relive all these things, the shakedown into security and the escorting, and here I'm walking down the corridors of power. When I did this, it reawakened something in me. And it was hard for me to deal with. But it reminded me that when I went down that hall, I was carrying every veteran on death row with me. I had the advantage, and I call it an advantage because it was really a blessing. When I was a paralegal in Angola, for the first time ever was given permission by the warden to spend the last 24 hours of his life with Dobie Gillis Williams. Dobie, at the time of his execution, was a 39-year-old black man that was tried and convicted by an all-white jury with a white prosecutor, a white judge, white sheriffs in the courtroom, and he was terrified. The night before his execution, I stood at the bars with him, talking to him, and we had his lawyer on the phone, and she was just crying and screaming, Dobie, there's nothing else I can do. I can't do anything else. And Dobie, for 39 years old, you'd have thought he was 90. He was crippled with arthritis. And that night, on the phone, he just held my hand. And it's a very hard thing to do. It's a very hard thing to experience. One thought kept running through my mind, and that was, I'm going to carry him as far as I can carry him. I watched them weigh him, measure him, photograph him, fingerprint him, because see, they have to make sure that they're killing the right man. It's very hard to do. And when I watched him walk out the door, he shackled, and he was smiling and waving at me. I'll live with that until the day I die. Our veterans are in the same shape. We send them to war. They face the horrors of war. They come home, and we ignore them. Governor DeSantis has had the opportunity 4 times this year to pick a veteran up and put him on his shoulder and carry him to safety. He's not done it. Instead, he's choosing to rush them to the chamber of death. And it's wrong. He's setting records already, and he has more in the works. It's time to stop executions for everyone, but most especially for our most vulnerable. Our most vulnerable are our veterans. They're the most deserving of our care, our empathy, and they're deserving of us picking them up and putting them on our shoulder and carrying them to safety. Thank you.
Thank you all so much for coming. We had a technical glitch at the beginning, so Captain Cody is going to give his comments again for the live stream, but the other veterans are here and available for questions. We can kind of have that going on simultaneously in the back of the room and hallway. And yeah, thank you all for coming, and please feel free to speak to the veterans if questions or myself. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Art Cody. I'm a retired U.S. Navy captain, and I'm currently the director of the Center for Veteran Criminal Advocacy. I served for over 30 years, some of that time in combat zones, most recently in Afghanistan. Today, we come to address what has become a paradox in Florida. Thanking veterans for their service, both combat and non-combat, has become a well-intentioned staple of our societal discourse. Veteran-specific services abound. To his credit, Governor DeSantis has spearheaded initiatives to assist veterans. Sympathy for battle-borne injuries, whether they be physical or mental, remains widespread. Yet, the veterans who are among the most profoundly mentally injured by the experiences of modern war are seemingly being singled out for execution. Florida is preparing to execute its 4th veteran of this year. Each of these veterans had service-connected post-traumatic stress disorder, traumatic brain injury, or other service-related disabilities. And I say service-connected because were it not for the fact they served, they would not have these particular mental health maladies, which are underlying, which have a significant impact upon the offenses of which they were convicted. Governor DeSantis has shown little compunction in selecting and putting severely mentally wounded combat veterans to death. There is widespread public recognition that veterans are different. They're a different population than their civilian counterparts. In fact, because nearly 1/3 of all veterans have been arrested, which is twice the rate of civilians. There has been, across the country, the establishment of veterans treatment courts to treat veterans who have been involved in lower level crimes. Similarly, the Supreme Court has recognized that veterans are entitled to a reasonable investigation and presentation of their military backgrounds. Judicial enforcement of that mandate by the Supreme Court has been sporadic at best. What I find in my work with veterans in the criminal justice system, particularly in appellate work, is that it is rare that the veteran's military background is presented adequately. And this is because only about 5% of the US population are veterans. And it is very hard to understand military culture with its nuances, vocabulary, acronyms, etc. So commonly, that particular part of the veteran's background does not get presented properly. And that's extremely important because for many veterans, I would say the vast majority of veterans, their service in the military, particularly if it involves combat, leaves an indelible mark upon them. It changes them. Commonly, with the small percentage of the American populace having served in the military, the only person in the courtroom who understands what that veteran has been through is the veteran himself. The increasing frequency with which combat veterans have been condemned and executed evidences the need for corresponding scrutiny of the circumstances that brought them into contact with the criminal justice system and eventually to execution. Let me make this very clear. The vast majority of our recruits enter the military with completely clean criminal records. Completely clean criminal records. After enlistment, however, they undergo an experience that is far removed from the people who will later sit in judgment of them. The arduous and at times gruesome conditions that are part and parcel of the military experience are frequently discussed in American media. We discuss the daily threat of danger from the daily threat of death from various sources, the necessity to engage enemies at close range, and the viewing of the aftermath of the carnage of modern war. And I say that because I think sometimes there's a misunderstanding of what our vets are seeing. The weapon systems that we currently employ in Iraq, or that we did employ in Iraq and Afghanistan, are capable of such destruction and such and widespread taking of human life. And I'm not saying whether that is or isn't necessary in war. What I am saying is our veterans see it in a way that previous generations did not. Such close and frequent association with violent death does not leave one unscathed. There is an expression, it's very true, in war, there are no unwounded soldiers. Veterans currently comprise about 10% of death row. That's twice the representation in the general population. And that proportion of veterans on death row is growing. One of the primary reasons for this overrepresentation is what veterans go through, particularly in terms of mental health, and the mental health issues that are common amongst veterans because of their service, particularly their combat service, simply do not exist in the general civilian populace. When we contemplate the fate of veterans who have been convicted of capital crimes, it is important, I would say essential, to bear in mind that combat-related brain injuries and mental health illnesses, such as post-traumatic stress disorder, are by no means unpredictable or unexpected. When we send our soldiers and our Marines to fight, we know for a fact that many of them will come back dramatically different. They will not come back okay. We know this going in. Although it's been referred to by other names throughout history, battle fatigue, soldier's heart, shell shock, Vietnam syndrome, post-traumatic stress has been a part of warfare since ancient times. It's written about in the Odyssey by Homer. It's been described in All Quiet on the Western Front, dealing with the First World War, certainly in World War II books, and every combat era since. More recently, a recent VA study concluded that nearly 30% of our veterans encounter or experience post-traumatic stress. In my experience of working with either veterans facing the death penalty or veterans who are already on death row, it is from this group of service members, this group of veterans, that the death row population is drawn. When I talk about this inconvenient truth, the fact that our veterans on death row, a significant underlying factor in the commission of their crimes was their combat experience and what they went through, I'm often countered with, well, not every veteran who returns home from war commits violent crime. Again, let me be clear on that. Combat service does not guarantee that a veteran will commit violent crimes. The vast majority do not. It is inescapable, however, that combat significantly increases the risk of mental health illness and other debilitating brain injuries, which give rise to the offenses for which they were convicted. Diminished mental capacity plays a large role in who gets death. In fact, the Supreme Court has recognized that certain specific groups are categorically excluded from the death penalty based upon mental capacity. Among these groups are children, defendants who committed their crimes under the age of 18, or people who are intellectually disabled. With this diminished mental capacity comes a decreased culpability. Mentally disabled combat veterans are no different. In fact, they are perhaps more deserving of our societal mercy, as the injuries they have suffered have come about because of their voluntary service to that same society's call. This is what service connected means. Were it not for the fact that they served their country, they would not have these mental health injuries, which are at the base of their offenses. Again, such frequent and close association with death does not leave one unscathed. It has a significant effect. Florida's governor should stop executing combat veterans, and the legislature should pass legislation banning the imposition of the death penalty upon mentally disabled combat veterans. Executing our nation's warriors should call for deep soul searching, not expedited executions. We owe combat veterans better than what they are now receiving in Florida's criminal justice system. Thank you.
thank you again, and thank you for your patience with that. And like I said, the veterans are all available for any questions, so, yeah.